Hi there, I'm Joey from EDH Rec. Let's have a tough conversation. If you've been playing Commander for really any length of time, you may have heard an odd refrain come up here and there a couple of times. As someone sits down to play and they pull out their deck, they may say something to the tune of, "Oh, I'm playing my Yidris deck." But don't worry, it's not that Yidris deck. If you're a little newer to the game, you might not know what that kind of statement even means, and I hope that this video can help to illuminate it. And if you're a seasoned EDH veteran, you might raise your eyebrows a bit at that kind of phrase, and still enter into that game with a lot of hypervigilance and caution, because based on prior experiences, it's kind of hard to trust that sentiment. So let's talk about that deck, and more importantly, what to do about it. First, let's lay some groundwork. Quote, that deck is not any single strategy. There are some well-known powerful combos out there, such as Thassa's Oracle and Friends, and many hyper-tuned EDH decks have all converged upon some of those same famous lines of play. But those are not what people mean when they talk about, quote, that Yidris deck, or that Keurig deck, or what have you. You can have that deck in any color combination. It's not really about any specific cards in the 99. Rather, calling something that deck is a way of expressing a particularly cutthroat build of that commander that plays in a no-holds-barred kind of way that runs counter to the expectations or desires of the rest of the playgroup. If I were to shorthand it, I'd say that deck is the one where if the commander gets to do the thing, as it were, the game is all but over. It either wins on the spot or it will have such a devastating impact that it would take a truly bonkers level of concerted effort from every other player to even try to unseat them. This is actually something you'll see very commonly on EDH Rec pages for commanders with wildly powerful abilities. Since the effects are powerful and players want to push limits in EDH, you'll often see commanders with pages full of optimized top-tier cards. As we always like to remind people, this is why we recommend using advanced filters. If you're trying to build something more low-key, filtering out data from decks that use cards you know you don't want to play will get you recommendations for cards that better bring about the type of gameplay you're actually seeking. And, of course, vice versa, if you do want to build in that way. You never have to get stuck with any one specific strategy, and don't fool yourself into thinking that there's only one accepted build for any commander, especially if that build path doesn't do what you like from that commander's abilities. And indeed, not everyone wants to build that deck when they sit down to brew a new commander that they like. That's how this conundrum comes up in the first place, right? You just think, oh, ninjas are cool, and I know that Yuriko would help me do ninja stuff, so I'll just build Yuriko with ninjas, because she's cool, right? But the problem is, her reputation precedes her. Players are savvy. We've seen lots of Yuriko decks out there that are that Yuriko deck. So before you even begin to play, you're fighting an uphill battle. Players may go after you and try to shut down your commander, perhaps even ignoring other big threats on the battlefield just to take you down, even though it seems wild to you. And they're doing it because, effectively, your commander just has a really bad PR problem, so to speak. They know what that commander can do. And even if that's not what you are doing with that commander, they can't afford to take that risk and be wrong about you. Because if they are wrong, they'll insta-lose. Sometimes we stumble into building commanders that are infamous for something broken that we're not even aware of. That's an important thing here. Even if you've been playing Commander for a long time, that doesn't mean you know all of the ins and outs of which of the hundreds of brand new legends have been making the rounds doing powerful and broken stuff. When someone says, don't worry, it's not that Bjorna deck, your first thought might not be, ah yes, I understand and I am now prepared for this game. Your first thought might be, wait, which one is Bjorna again? In addition to how complicated it can be to just try and simply be aware of which commanders have become infamous, the issue of power level is also pretty big when we talk about that deck. If I were to say, don't worry, it's not that Atraxa deck, which Atraxa do you think I'm referring to? I bet a whole bunch of people will think that I'm talking about the original Atraxa, auto-ulting a bunch of planeswalkers, or perhaps proliferating a bunch of poison counters. But a bunch of other people will think that instead I'm referring to the new Atraxa, which has quickly become a high-tier competitive EDH legend. Now, both are capable of producing a that deck type of experience, but I personally wonder if it's more likely for the original Atraxa to receive a that deck type of label than the new Atraxa, because of the environments in which they see the most play. In a competitive environment, I mean, everyone is playing that deck, so this isn't a concern. In fact, it's the expectation, like bring your A game because no one's pulling any punches. It's only outside of that environment, in that nebulous space that is powerful but not competitive, that is social but still filled with hundreds of really broken cards, that this becomes the potential worry. Because ultimately, the hallmark of that deck is that it gets in the way of what the group was hoping to get out of that game. And knowledge of high-power decks can muddy the waters a lot when players are attempting to describe deck power level to each other. Knowing what a competitively optimized deck is capable of changes the scales in your mind. This is one of the reasons why a number system has always been a pretty bogus way to describe your deck, right? Not only will everyone default to the cop-out "my deck is a 7" answer, but also one person's version of a 10 might be what another person considers to be an 8. Thus, we encounter the unfortunate social conundrum where players build decks like the new Atraxa, like Kinnan, like Najeela, like Yidris, fully aware of the PR problems that those commanders have, and they don't build those decks in the competitive way that brought about that PR problem, and therefore they feel that it's accurate to say that it's not that Najeela deck. And it's true, it's not that Najeela deck. It is not the most competitive or optimized way to build that commander. But just because they're not playing top tier doesn't mean they are playing something that's right for the rest of the group. I've encountered many players who aren't playing the optimized version of a deck, and they declare that. They say, I'm not playing that type of the deck. But then in the game, they still realize, oh, shoot, I went a little bit too far, huh? And I've also, unfortunately, encountered tons of players who intentionally use the "it's not that deck" type of statement more or less as a smokescreen. Basically, they're angle shooting, right? Like, by declaring that it's not the best version, they're hoping to draw less initial attention to themselves early in the game so that they can get away with doing something that's still utterly bananas bonkers more powerful than what everyone else brought to the table. Like, just because they're not playing the first or even the second best version of a deck doesn't mean they're not still punching down on everyone else. Like, yeah, you didn't bring weapons-grade plutonium or whatever, but you still brought a bazooka to a Nerf sword fight. And you knew you were doing it. This is why people may react with concern and caution and even maybe outright skepticism when you present a commander and say that you're not playing that version of the commander. Because in the past, maybe we've played against people who didn't lie precisely, but they still took advantage of the group's trust by being misleading. And in case it isn't clear, this type of thing is not unique to only games against strangers. Just as much, people in regular playgroups can have some folks in those groups that they clash with because of situations like this that occur in those groups too. And that makes me feel bad for the players who really are genuinely just trying to play some silly stuff, like trying to play Beamtown Bullies without all of those one-hit KO cards that it's become famous for, or trying to play Derevi without any of those lockdown stacks cards that she's known for synergizing so well with. Not only do they have to worry about their commander's PR problem, but they're also inhabiting a space that other people have used to be devious. So then every move that they make is getting hyper scrutinized for evidence of dishonesty. And having that magnifying glass on you from the word go can really affect how you play, and it can feel like it unfairly draws attention away from other players whose commanders are less obvious, but whose decks are still very threatening and require attention to disrupt. There's one more wrinkle on this too, though, which is the reality that some commanders really are just so bananas that, frankly, it doesn't matter how you build them, right? Commanders like King Kenrith or Koma or whatever, commanders that are so mystifyingly unbalanced in their design that even if you build it in the jankiest way possible, I still can't let them live. Like, you're right, you're not playing that Kenrith deck. But you're still playing a Kenrith deck, so sorry not sorry, Deadly Rollick is coming for your commander. Now, before I get to the "so what do we do about this" part, I think it's proper for me to point out that there's an opportunity for a somewhat cynical view to emerge here. The problem, some might say, isn't with the decks or with the commanders, but rather with the people who are complaining about them. That it isn't an issue with the cards, that there's a very reasonable expectation that in EDH you pack interaction because everyone's trying to do something powerful. Everyone is trying to win because that's the structure of the game, and that if you don't like something, you should just keep it off the board instead of whining about it. And there's a degree to which I'm sympathetic to this argument, because just as much as some people will use not that deck as a smokescreen to cloak that they're still planning on doing some busted stuff at a higher power level than everyone else, plenty of other players will use the opposite type of a complaint as a smokescreen too. They'll point the finger and claim that someone else's stuff is way overpowered, when really what they're actually upset about is that they didn't get to win. I mean, this sucks to talk about, but we've probably all been in a game where one person whined a whole lot that they were getting picked on, and then as soon as there wasn't any pressure directed their way, they suddenly took over the whole game and won on the spot, right? I'm not alone in that experience. I can't be. Or we've encountered the kind of person who complains that counterspells locked them out of the game, when really what happened is that a counterspell stopped them from winning in that moment. Or where anytime anyone minorly disrupts their game in any way or plays a card that they don't like, they make a whole scene out of it. And yeah, that's not a good look on you, pal. I don't know where you got the audacity, but you can put it back. So again, I'm sympathetic to that type of argument, but overall, I can't get completely on board with the idea that the real problem lies with the players who get disgruntled about the that decks of the world, because I've just seen so many times where 3 people did an excellent job of stating their desires for what they want from a game, and then one other person misled them and took advantage of it for an easy win. Or I've been the person who built a Keurig deck or a Yidris deck, and I went out of my way to avoid the most optimized versions of those commanders. I tried to make it not busted, and yet I still dominated everyone else's time. That's not an issue with the other 3 people. I cannot lay blame at someone else's feet for that. And thinking back to those moments where I severely overshot the mark, man, I knew they weren't having a good time, and I knew that they were just far too polite to say anything about it. And there was just this great big hot drop of shame because I felt like I'd lied, even though I didn't lie. And I remember my ego screaming to defend myself, to try and save face and explain, well, here are all the steps that I took to avoid that version of the deck. But that tactic in that moment really risks you just digging yourself in deeper and not saving any face at all. As a matter of fact, I've seen people really double down in those types of moments. Like, they played something that was so bonkers that even if everyone had focused on them all game, they probably still would have won. And then when they notice that the attitude at the table has shifted from communal joy to a thin silence, they feel a need to try and save face. But the tactic that they employ is actually to shift blame. And that's when you start to hear maybe things like, well, I was only able to do this because you didn't play enough removal. Or, well, it's not like I was playing X or Y. Or, well, your commander is yada yada, stuff like that. It's tough to witness, and it gets real messy. Now, maybe I'm bringing some of my own baggage into this, but from those experiences, I don't think it's unreasonable to say that some of the arguments floating around out there emerge because of these situations and misunderstandings. Like the play more removal argument, for instance. Yes, it's true. Some people really do neglect to bring interaction in their decks, and it can be pretty annoying when those folks complain about stuff. But also, isn't it true that some people invoke the just play more removal argument as a means of shifting shame and blame away from themselves after they just committed an EDH faux pas? And of course, rather than doubling down, some people in these situations, when they've overshot the mark, will apologize to the rest of the group. Like, I didn't know my deck was going to do that, or things like that. And unfortunately, that's its own different type of complication, right? Because, yeah, sometimes it's appropriate. I've been in that position before, certainly. But also there are some times where it feels even worse, or it doesn't feel like it's administered appropriately. For instance, there's just something about a person apologizing after they just tutored for their 2 best lock pieces that makes me feel like the apology is maybe a little disingenuous, you know? So after all this rambling, we get to the main thing. What do you actually do about that deck? What do you do when you have a commander that you want to play, but you can't escape its PR problem? What do you do when you don't even know its infamous capabilities well enough to explain how you're trying to avoid them? Do you dump your entire deck face up on the table every time you play just to try and prove that you're not up to anything nefarious? What do you do when someone else says that they're not playing that deck, but then the deck that they are playing is still pretty miserable? What do you do when you spent so much money on a deck that turns out to have produced a game state that not everyone enjoyed? Well, in my opinion, it's not about whether you're playing that deck. It's about whether you're being that player. This is a game. It's a social game. It's a vehicle through which we get to decorate our lives with the company of other enjoyable people. The individual cards and the decks that we play don't matter a tenth as much as the people we get to enjoy it with. The people I have the most fun playing with are the people who care about everyone having a good time. The people who play like they want to be invited back. The people who inspire me to have better sportsmanship myself. If you really want to prove you're not playing that type of deck, it'll help if you're not being that type of player. I've committed many Commander faux pas over the years, and luckily in those moments, the people that I play with have had grace with me because other experiences have helped inform them where my heart's really at. Even if you're playing with absolute strangers who have no prior experiences with you, this is still possible because the way that you've handled yourself before that point and the way that you handle it during those awkward scenarios will also do a whole lot to affect how people feel and respond to you. And to be extra clear, I'm super not saying that the only acceptable tactic is an apology in those moments where you've accidentally played that deck and overshot the mark. In fact, far from it. I'm actually going to use another Magic creator here as a fantastic example, and that's Krim, aka the Asian Avenger. I think it's safe to say that Krim is known for being the guy who does play that deck a lot of the time. Every game that I've played against him, it has been such an uphill battle. The dude is the archenemy all the dang time. If his deck is able to do the thing, he will dominate the entire game. And playing against him is so dang fun because of the way that he handles those scenarios. Like, if you're familiar with wrestling terms, Krim is so good at playing the heel. He's just as fun to root for as he is to root against. He doesn't play dumb. He doesn't try to deflect whether or not he's the threat. He doesn't try and pull some ooh, did I do that BS? No, he knows he's the threat and he owns it. And he evokes such an enjoyable energy for everyone else by giving them a common cause to try and collectively dismantle. So even if he is playing that deck, he's not being that player. He's being a total mensch. So if you find yourself with that deck, see if you can't pull a Krim and find a way for the table to still really enjoy the archenemy experience. If you're frustrated that you always seem to get targeted because people think you're playing that deck when you're not, give them some space to air that concern, because ultimately you know where they're coming from. You've probably been in that position too. And if you want them to hear you out, you've got to hear them out. And if you've gone really far out of your way to avoid that deck, but you're still punching too hard with it, and you don't want to scrap it, you've put so much work into this deck, what do? Well, man, there's nothing that Commander players love more than tinkering with decks. And I bet you'd be able to get a whole lot of help with that deck from other people who've gone through similar experiences. You can probably get them in the comments of this very video. So seek out some deck help, because I bet it will help. And if you find yourself playing against that deck, I don't think the card should be the focus in that situation, but rather figuring out whether you're playing against that type of player. Because maybe your styles will just clash, no matter what cards are being wielded by either of you. And figuring that out is going to be a much better basis for figuring out how to proceed from there. And of course, even if you're not the one playing that deck, it's still possible for you to be that player to other people. So hold yourself accountable too. That's it from me. I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this one. Like, subscribe, comment, do all of the things that appease the YouTube gods. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.